watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome to Morning at NTV. In case you're just joining in, if you have been a part of the conversation and also have been through the entire show, well, we're now getting into our Tech Notes segment, and this morning we're going to be taking a look at the plight of people living with disabilities within our country during this COVID-19 pandemic time as a country we try to fight it. Now, as we have that conversation, we're also going to be pointing our direction of the conversation to women who are living with disabilities at this time. And joining me for that conversation is Alana Kembabazi. She is the program manager, IZAR. Welcome to Morning at NTV, Alana.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here.
Alana,
and to be really having this very important conversation.
Well, we're going to start with what the challenges of people living with disabilities are facing at this time within the country.
Well, thank you, Rita. I think that the pandemic has really highlighted the structural discrimination that has been happening for a long time for persons with disabilities. We have known for a long time that persons with disabilities struggle to access healthcare. For example, in 2017, the Uganda National Association of the Deaf, together with IZAR, filed a petition at the Constitutional Court arguing that the lack of sign language interpreters, something as basic as that in health facilities, meant that many of them could not get public health information. They could not be able to speak to their doctors and get any access to healthcare at all, were denied sexual reproductive information, and their rights to privacy were just completely obliterated. We've known for a long time that facilities are not up to code, particularly health facilities with a building code, which requires accessibility and ramps. We've also known that persons with disabilities are more vulnerable to poverty. Many of them have been left out of formal education systems because of the lack of paying attention to reasonable accommodation and accessibility. Many of them struggle to have jobs, and this whatever measures we're taking during the course of this pandemic has had a disproportionate effect on them. The World Health Organization at the start of this pandemic did warn, and so did the CDC in the States, did warn that it should have a disproportionate effect on persons with disabilities, and that states must be very proactive in thinking through what some of those challenges are. Persons with disabilities, while they may not be directly vulnerable initially unless they have pre-existing conditions, the structural discrimination makes them more vulnerable. So, for example, if you are relying on, a visual aid, or you're visually impaired, right? You often have to touch surfaces, which is one of the things we know is a big red flag right now in terms of contamination. If you need a sign language interpreter in this period of social distancing, normally you'd pay for your sign language interpreter to go with you to a health facility or to just help you communicate. Now you're not able to have a lot of those services unless they are direct family members. If you've been able to somehow find a way to work, if you've been often relying on like a border. We know many poor persons with disabilities do rely on borders to get to places. That has been cut off. They rely on borders to get to health facilities, workplaces. And if you've been getting some form of education, particularly for the children, again, with the schools being shut down and the fact that learning has now transitioned to radio, to TV, without adequate attention paid about the need for accessible formats, like having visual aids and other things, again, their learning has been cut off. And then right now, as we're thinking about food, we're talking about, in the earlier discussion I did hear you are discussing the MP, for example, about food. People are getting to him to have food. They're trying to lobby how to get food. If you're a person with disability, if you're not being prioritized, which we know hasn't been the case, the food has just been sort of given out household to household. You may not even know they're there if you cannot hear. And you might not be able to even just move the basic movement you need to have to get this food, which is very vulnerable. Yet at the same time, we know persons with disabilities won't be able to walk the distances to the food shops. Will likely, again, because of the intersecting levels of vulnerability like poverty, will often also not have the spare cash to buffer this period in terms of getting and stocking up on groceries. So whatever we are seeing happening for ordinary Ugandans is very exacerbated for this vulnerable group.
That's very true. Now, just to take it back to the beginning, when we mention all the structures within the government, one of the things that has often been said and continues to be said is these messages about wash your hands, you need to stay home, stay safe. All these messages that are being disseminated by the government, do you think that they have been clear enough to the people living with disabilities, from the sign language, just from those who are blind to those that are deaf? Is this message being given to them and clearly as possibly can be?
Yeah, I definitely don't think so. You know, it's only, and I was discussing this last week, it's only, I think, midway last week that they say that, for example, have sign language interpreters at official briefings. Some TV stations had tried to have sign language interpreters, which, by the way, is a requirement. All TV stations are supposed to be having this, but some were doing so. But at the official press briefings of the task force, for so long, this wasn't something that was being done. So there was a whole community of persons with hearing disabilities, for example, left out. They are finally doing so, but again, it's a little late. If you think about the first time we heard about what was happening, the measures, there's a lot of time that has been wasted. The Ministry of Health has finally now put up a video that is not, you know, we often have these speaking videos around washing your hands. If you can't hear, you're completely left out. They now have one with some words, but even that video, in terms, if you have a visual disability, the text, the font, the contrast will make it hard for you to see. And if you are, again, if you're someone from a lower income strata, there's a lot of words in that video, very little imagery. One of the things that has been really recommended to countries is to use very simplified formats in describing this. The main way of communicating for our country has been radio, right? Or these sort of public announcement systems. And again, a huge population is just being completely ignored. But also, I think the communication should have also been targeted, recognizing that persons with disabilities will often rely on a lot more outside help than sort of the ordinary Ugandan would, in terms, particularly if they have physical disabilities, because they will often have to have someone assist them. So there are certain questions you will need to probably ask the person assisting, whether it's your interpreter or the person assisting you bathing and so forth. Have you washed your hands? You know, you are at a greater risk because you can't really social distance. So telling them in a blanket way, like the messages have been, which is social distance, don't send, like, it's not sort of very practical, because they may want very specific tips. And we've seen in other countries that has been done, but in Uganda's case, it hasn't. It's an issue that has continuously been raised by persons with disability representative organizations. And it also shows a bigger problem, because if there had been participation of people who represent persons with disabilities right from the start, when you're thinking about the communication, this could have been avoided. But for right now, we are still seeing very, very small steps to address this. The other big barrier around communication is the OTT, right? Because, for example, we're engaging with we use WhatsApp. A number of them, none of them are able to use WhatsApp, but you have to disseminate some of these messages. So it is something that still needs to be addressed.
A network issue, we can't clearly hear you. Alana, could you be able to just repeat that?
I was saying that, can you hear me now?
We can be able to hear you. Can just go ahead.
Yes, I was saying that the other hurdle beyond the government sort of delay and failure to put this information in accessible formats has been the reluctance to roll back OTT and other ways and other barriers that persons with disabilities are facing in accessing information. Okay. OTT is a particularly huge barrier for the person with hearing disability community. They've voiced it repeatedly. And we know from our own experience that one of the quickest ways in which we do communicate with this community has been through OTT, and that's also how they communicate. And so if you're not able to roll it back, then they're not been able to benefit from the WhatsApp messages. And you know, for so many of us, we're getting a lot of information on WhatsApp. Yeah. The symptoms to look out for, how to get emergency access. And I do want to add that because the information around this pandemic has evolved so much, if you remember in the beginning, it said we could touch, we could knock shoulders, right? Then we had to stay apart 1 meter, then 2, then 4 meter. So someone has to be able to get this information quickly and
Yes.
instantly.
Now,
And social media has been a huge platform for the government in disseminating this, but with a substantial part of the population left out because of barriers like OTT, uh, there's a huge gap there. I would also say that the last part that is around communication, it is tied, is the fact that when you're trying to get emergency services, you have to call.
yes,
Right?
definitely.
And if you cannot hear or if you cannot speak,
It's harder
you're
for
just
you.
completely left out. And the fact that there are no alternatives at this point is very distressing.
Well, to take it to Alana, you mentioned a bit about organizations. Now, how non-government organizations are adapting to helping the persons with disabilities in these times. How is that coming along?
I think that this has been complicated. First of all, by the fact that you have to have a sticker that shows you're an essential worker. You would have loved to see the person with disability organizations, and they have requested to be able to get certain cars allocated to them to conduct the rapid response to members, right? Because we do know, for example, that right now, with the very few ambulances we have, that when you go to the RDC, you wait and you wait and you may be helped tomorrow, and then it's a whole waiting game. And persons with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to this because they often will not have the alternative means to get to the health facilities, for example, and also whether they're walking or having private cars, again because of what we've seen in the data about the income strata. And this is a place where persons with disability organizations could have played a larger role, but then again, and they have requested for things like basic things like movement stickers and being able to do that rapid response, and the government has not been proactive in recognizing this and voicing their concerns. So I think that beyond sort of checking in and highlighting the individual experiences that they're hearing about, there is very little, their potential has not been realized. And ideally, because we recognize the government at this point is grappling with different things, this would have been a partnership that is so obvious. And the fact that it hasn't been done is a wasted opportunity here.
So going forward, what do we need to see being done? Because for a number of people, uncertainty looms of when this will end. But going forward, what do we need to see organizations and also the government doing for people living with disabilities?
I think that there should be, first of all, participation of persons with disabilities throughout, whether it's on the task force or the district local government. Like I say, this is a group that's already very organized and has representative organizations. We have the Equal Opportunities Commission. We also have a department within the Ministry of Gender. And so having these representatives involved in the planning, in the implementation of this rapid response is very critical, because some of those things are not things that government officials are obviously thinking about. Because like I say to you, we already have a pattern of discrimination in this country against this group. Our policies have and implementation have often failed to prioritize this group. And it's really important that there is participation on how best to do that. We could see standard operating procedures. They're vulnerable categories, and you will have your rollout of how we're dealing with pandemic, but you have to recognize that some people face the brunt more than others, and persons with disabilities do. Just like we've talked about pregnant women. Now, if you're a pregnant woman with a disability, your vulnerability is a lot more compounded. And so having standard operating procedures that say, okay, for example, are we going to have are they going to be given first priority when it comes to sort of ambulances? Like, what are those standard operating procedures? And this should be done in consultation with the persons with disabilities community. It's really important, again, the issue of accessible communication. Again, we applaud what government is beginning to do after repeated complaints, but it does to do a lot more to make sure that this information, particularly around prevention, is getting to these communities by making sure it's there in accessible formats. We want to see the same thing around accessible formats for whatever learning materials have to happen for the children with disabilities during this time.
Yeah.
And we also do want to see a focus on social protection. For example, if you're giving out food, you would think that this would be the first group that is prioritized.
Yeah.
Again, like I've said, because our own data recognizes that they face multiple levels of vulnerability. If there's, and there have been grants in the past that do touch on persons with disabilities, those grants should be continued during this period. In fact, international guidance has often asked for them to get some cash grants because yes, they may be able to get food, but they may not be able to get other things right now, again, because of their heightened levels of vulnerability. And I think what we need to be clear about right now, and which is not coming through very, very clearly, is that failure to do so, failure to actually think through how you're reaching this community is discrimination.
Yes.
And
now,
discrimination
Alana,
that is prohibited by our constitution, which not only prohibits discrimination, but requires us to go a step further and take affirmative action. Our constitution recognizes that they're not all equal, and we need to be able to have some tailor-made strategies
for particular groups of people.
Really advancing certain vulnerable groups.
Well, thank you so much, Alana Kembawezi, for your time this morning. She has highlighted some of the challenges that persons with disabilities are living with at this point in time in our country. And for a number of you, you're able-bodied and you are facing a hard time already now. For these people, it's even a harder time.